August 6, 1945. 8:15 in the morning, Field Marshal Shunroku Hata stood in his headquarters inside Hiroshima Castle, reviewing deployment plans for the defense of southern Japan. Through the window, summer heat already shimmered above the Ota River Delta. Behind him, staff officers shuffled maps and casualty projections for Operation Ketsugo, the planned Armageddon battle that would turn the war's tide. Then came the flash. What the field marshal and his generals said in the hours that followed would reveal something profound about certainty colliding with the incomprehensible, about military minds trained to calculate odds, suddenly unable to calculate anything at all. The city of Hiroshima had been spared. That's what residents whispered in the summer of 1945. Tokyo burned. Osaka smoldered. Nagoya lay in ruins. 64 Japanese cities had been systematically destroyed by American firebombing, yet Hiroshima remained untouched. Some believed their relatives in California had petitioned Washington. Others thought the Americans wanted the city intact for occupation headquarters. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Hiroshima had been saved because the United States wanted to measure with scientific precision what happened when a single atomic bomb obliterated an unscarred target. On the morning of August 6th, approximately 340,000 civilians lived in Hiroshima. Another 40,000 military personnel were stationed throughout the city. At the heart of this garrison sat Hiroshima Castle, headquarters of the Second General Army. Field Marshal Hata commanded 400,000 men from this nerve center, most deployed on Kyushu, where American invasion forces were expected to land. The Field Marshal was 66 years old, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, a career soldier who had risen through artillery ranks to become one of only 4 men in Japan holding the rank of Gensui, Marshal General. His record was distinguished, his confidence was absolute. That morning, his headquarters hummed with the machinery of war. Staff officers updated defensive positions. Communications specialists monitored reports from across western Japan. Intelligence analysts studied patterns in American B-29 formations. Everything proceeded according to the logic of military operations. Until 8:15. The temperature at ground level reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a second. The flash came first, cutting across the sky from east to west, a light so brilliant it burned shadows into stone. Then the blast wave, a wall of compressed air traveling faster than sound, tearing through the city with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Hiroshima Castle, despite its reinforced walls, despite its position of strength, ceased to exist as a functioning military installation in the span of a heartbeat. 80 staff officers died instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Yi Ah-yu, a prince of the Korean imperial family serving as a general staff officer, was killed at his desk. The explosion occurred 500 feet from the Aioi Bridge, directly above Shima Hospital, just over half a mile from the castle. Field Marshal Hata was thrown across the room. When he stood, blood streaking down his face from a head wound, he found himself commanding not an army, but a cemetery. His senior surviving officer was Colonel Kumao Imoto, badly wounded but conscious. Through shattered windows, they could see what had become of their city. Everything within a mile of the explosion had simply vanished. Bronze statues had melted, roof tiles had fused into glass, human beings half a mile away had been vaporized, leaving only shadows where they'd stood. Beyond the zone of instant death, fires were beginning. In Tokyo, 450 miles to the northeast, nobody knew what had happened. Communications from Hiroshima had gone silent. The last radio transmission had been routine, a weather report at 8 a.m. Now there was nothing. Army headquarters tried repeatedly to raise the Second General Army. Every call met silence. At the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito was preparing for another day of the endless war. He had risen at his usual hour, reviewed the morning reports, received his military advisors. The reports were grim but familiar. American submarines strangling shipping lanes, B-29s prowling the skies, Soviet forces massing on the Manchurian border. The Empire was losing, slowly being ground down, but the plan remained unchanged: inflict such catastrophic casualties on the American invasion force that Japan could negotiate something other than unconditional surrender. Everything depended on Operation Ketsu-Go. Everything depended on the will to continue fighting. At 7:50 that evening, more than 11 hours after the blast, the Emperor learned that Hiroshima had been attacked with some new type of weapon. In War Minister General Kurichika Anami's office, senior officers gathered around radios, trying to piece together what had occurred. Initial reports were fragmentary, contradictory, almost fantastical. An entire city destroyed by a single bomb? Impossible. A weapon that produced a mushroom-shaped cloud visible for miles? Absurd. The Americans were known for incendiary bombing, for saturation attacks that dropped thousands of bombs from hundreds of aircraft. But one plane, one bomb, one city. Minister Anami, 58 years old, a hardliner who had argued for continuing the war even as American forces island-hopped toward the homeland, made a statement that would echo through the confused hours that followed. "I am convinced that the Americans had only one bomb after all." It was a hope dressed as military analysis. It was also catastrophically wrong. None of them knew it yet, but 200 miles southwest, a young physicist named Yoshio Nishina was already preparing to travel to Hiroshima. He alone might be able to tell them what they were facing, and what he would discover would shatter every assumption about how wars could be fought, how cities could be destroyed, and how quickly certainty could turn to ash. On the evening of August 6th, physicist Yoshio Nishina received a restricted press release from President Harry S. Truman. The language was unambiguous. The United States had used an atomic bomb against Hiroshima. Nishina, 54 years old, wearing the khaki uniform and white headband of a patriotic citizen rather than the clothes of Japan's preeminent nuclear physicist, read the statement twice. His hands did not shake. His expression did not change. But he knew immediately that Truman was telling the truth. Nishina had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. He had built Japan's first cyclotron. He had led his country's own atomic weapons program, work that had conclusively demonstrated one thing above all: creating an atomic bomb was stupendously, impossibly difficult. His own team, with years of effort and the backing of the Imperial Army, had managed to produce only 170 grams of uranium hexafluoride by mid-1944. The Americans had produced it by the ton. When Japan's military asked Nishina if an atomic bomb could be built in time to matter, he told them no. Not even the United States could accomplish it within the war's time frame. He had been wrong. Early on August 7th, Nishina boarded a plane with a team of 30 scientists, Army doctors, and engineers led by Army Lieutenant General Arisue. As the aircraft approached Hiroshima, Nishina looked down at what had once been a city. The entire central district was gone, not damaged, not burning, but erased. A scorched desert stretched for miles. Even from the air, even expecting destruction, the scale of it made his scientific certainty waver. This was not a weapon. This was a window into hell. They landed and entered the ruins. The heat still radiated from the ground. Fires continued to burn in pockets throughout the devastation. Bodies, thousands upon thousands, lay where they had fallen or crawled before dying. The smell was beyond description, but Nishina had come for evidence, not emotions. He needed proof that physical matter in Hiroshima had been exposed to an extremely high dose of radiation delivered in an extremely short span of time. Without Geiger-Müller tubes or other specialized detection equipment, he had to improvise. He asked the Akatsuki Maritime Command, the local IJA organization coordinating rescue efforts, to provide bodies for autopsy. Not civilians, which would raise ethical and jurisdictional complications, but soldiers. Specifically, soldiers who showed no external injuries, no burns, no wounds from blast or debris. He needed bodies of men killed at a molecular level. In a requisitioned textile factory, an army doctor named Kosaka made the first incision. The soldier on the table looked peaceful, almost as if sleeping. But when the abdomen was opened, Kosaka stopped. The stomach looked as though it had been scoured with a wire brush. Every small passage of the internal organs was clogged with blood. The bone marrow showed signs of catastrophic cellular destruction. This was radiation poisoning on a scale Nishina had only theorized about. For Nishina, this was the confirmation he needed. That evening, he reported his initial findings to the Prime Minister's office. The next day, his team prepared a formal written report to Imperial General Headquarters. This bomb was neither dynamite nor an incendiary weapon. It has been clearly identified as an atomic bomb. In Tokyo, the military leadership's reaction was immediate and revealing. The Imperial Army declared they would only concede it was an atomic bomb after a thorough investigation. But the Imperial Navy's response was more telling. Top naval leaders allowed that the Americans might have used an atomic bomb, but insisted they could not possess more atomic bombs. Or if they did, they would not be that powerful. This reaction stemmed directly from Japan's own atomic program. Because Nishina had educated military leaders about the immense difficulty of producing fissionable material, they could not conceive that America had overcome these obstacles at scale. It was an intellectual trap. Their own failure had blinded them to their enemy's success. Minister of War Anami seized on this uncertainty. His conviction hardened into doctrine. The Americans had one bomb, perhaps two at most. Japan could endure. The strategy remained viable. Operation Ketsugo would proceed. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima, Field Marshal Hata had taken command of the shattered city. Since Mayor Senkichi Awaya had been killed at the mayoral residence, the wounded field marshal became the senior surviving authority. He coordinated relief efforts from whatever temporary headquarters could be established. Soldiers from the undamaged port at Ujina used suicide motorboats, originally intended to repel the American invasion, to collect the wounded and transport them downriver to the military hospital. Trucks and trains brought in supplies and evacuated survivors. The numbers were incomprehensible, at least 80,000 dead in the first moments. By the end of the first day, perhaps 100,000. Those were only the ones who could be counted. Many more had been vaporized completely, leaving nothing to count at all. And the dying continued. Radiation sickness was setting in. People who had seemed to survive the blast began hemorrhaging internally, their hair falling out, their immune systems collapsing. On August 8th, the emperor met privately with Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo. What passed between them was decisive. The emperor stated clearly, "Now that this sort of weapon has been used, it is becoming increasingly impossible to continue the war. I do not think it is a good idea to miss an opportunity to end the war by attempting to secure advantageous conditions." This was not a decision made lightly. For months, the emperor had resisted ending the war without first achieving a military victory that would strengthen Japan's negotiating position. But the atomic bomb had changed the calculus, not just because of its destructive power, but because of what it represented. If the Americans could destroy cities one at a time from the air without invasion, then Operation Ketsugo, the entire strategic foundation of Japan's last stand, was meaningless. But the emperor's conviction was not enough. Japan's governing system required unanimity among the Big Six, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, and 3 members of that council refused to accept surrender. On the morning of August 9th, the Big Six finally met to discuss Hiroshima. But by the time they gathered, 2 new catastrophes had struck. At 2 minutes past midnight Tokyo time, Soviet forces had launched a massive invasion of Manchuria, tearing through Japanese positions with overwhelming force. And at 11:02 that morning, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, more powerful than the first, detonated over Nagasaki. The meeting stretched through the day. Foreign Minister Togo, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, and Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai argued for accepting the Potsdam Declaration with only one condition: preservation of the imperial system. But Minister of War Anami, Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Soemu Toyoda demanded 3 additional conditions. Japan would disarm its own forces. Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials. There would be no occupation of Japanese territory. These conditions were, in effect, a rejection of surrender. And because cabinet decisions required unanimity, the deadlock held. Through the windows of the meeting room, Tokyo's summer heat pressed down. Somewhere in the rubble of Hiroshima, radiation continued its invisible work. And in laboratories and hangars across the Pacific, American scientists and air crews were preparing additional atomic bombs that could be ready within days. Just before midnight on August 9th, an unprecedented gathering convened at the Imperial Palace. An imperial conference, held in the emperor's presence, brought together the divided Big Six and Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council. This was constitutional theater. The deadlock would be laid bare before the emperor, who would then break it with his personal intervention. Such a thing had not been done in living memory. The room was stifling, not just from August heat, but from the weight of what was being decided. Each man spoke in turn, making the same arguments they had made all day, knowing the emperor listened. Minister of War Anami argued with particular intensity. Yes, the atomic bombs were terrible. Yes, the Soviet invasion was a blow. But Japan could still fight. Operation Ketsu-Go remained viable. The Americans would have to invade. And when they did, casualties would be so catastrophic that Japan could still negotiate favorable terms. Army Chief of Staff Umezu went further, insisting the Soviet invasion was merely unfavorable, but did not invalidate the defensive strategy in which he still had confidence. Admiral Toyoda estimated, with no evidence whatsoever, that the Americans could have no more than 1 or 2 additional atomic bombs. Japan could endure. Japan must endure. Then Emperor Hirohito spoke. His voice was quiet. He noted that military leaders had promised him victory at Okinawa and had failed. They had promised the defenses on Kyushu were impregnable, but intelligence suggested otherwise. They had assured him the Soviet Union would mediate peace, and instead the Soviets had invaded. Now they promised that Operation Ketsu-Go would succeed. He could not believe them anymore. More than that, he could no longer ask his people to endure what was coming. The atomic bomb, he said, made continuing the war impossible. Not just strategically impossible, but morally impossible. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer, he said. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration, preserving only the imperial institution. The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the military leaders acknowledged the emperor's decision. Even Anami, even Umezu, even Toyoda, men who had argued for fighting to the last citizen, bowed their heads. The emperor had spoken. The decision was made. But the war was not over. Not yet. Word of the emperor's decision spread quickly through Tokyo's military establishment, and not everyone accepted it. In the early hours of August 15th, approximately 1,000 officers and enlisted men launched a coup attempt, raiding the imperial palace to destroy the recording of the emperor's surrender announcement. They were convinced, with an intensity beyond reason, that Japan could still win, that the homeland battle would change everything, that surrender was not just defeat, but betrayal of everything they had fought for. The coup failed. The emperor's announcement was broadcast at noon on August 15th. In formal, archaic Japanese, he told his subjects that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable. For the first time in Japanese history, the common people heard their emperor's voice. Many wept. Some felt relief that the suffering would end. Others felt shame that they had failed their divine sovereign. A few felt rage that the military had brought them to this point. Field Marshal Hayter, still coordinating relief efforts in the ruins of Hiroshima, heard the broadcast in a makeshift headquarters. His face showed nothing, but shortly after he requested, formally through proper military channels, that he be stripped of his rank of Field Marshal in atonement for the Army's failure. The request was never processed. There was no longer an administrative structure capable of processing it. The war had ended, and with it, the system that had created his rank in the first place. Minister of War Anami spent August 14th in a state of carefully controlled composure. He signed the surrender document with the rest of the cabinet. He ordered his subordinates to obey the emperor's decision. He refused to join the coup plotters. And then, in the early morning hours of August 15th, in his private quarters, he committed seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment. His suicide note was cryptic. I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime. What crime? Leading the army to defeat? Advocating for continued war? Surviving when so many had died? The note did not say. Perhaps all of it. Perhaps something more personal that could not be articulated. He died believing that he had served with honor, even in failure. Yoshio Nishina returned to Tokyo after his investigation in Hiroshima. He wrote detailed reports on radiation effects, on the bomb's mechanism, on the medical consequences that would continue for years. On November 22, 1945, American occupation forces arrived at his laboratory. They dismantled his cyclotrons, the same cyclotrons he had used to prove Japan could not build an atomic bomb in time, and dumped the parts into Tokyo Bay. The act created a furor among American scientists who protested the destruction of valuable research equipment. But the Occupation Command's message was clear. Japan's atomic program, such as it had been, was over. What none of them knew, what perhaps no one could have known, was that by the time Japan surrendered, the United States had no more atomic bombs ready to deploy. The entire arsenal had been used. If Japan had held out another week, another month, the Americans would have had to resume conventional bombing and wait for additional nuclear weapons to be assembled. The margin was thinner than anyone, on either side, understood at the time. In the years immediately following the war, survivors struggled to articulate what had happened to them. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of the communications hospital, who had climbed a hill to look down at the ruins, wrote, "I saw that Hiroshima had disappeared. I was shocked by the sight. What I felt then and still feel now, I just can't explain with words. Hiroshima didn't exist. That was mainly what I saw. Hiroshima just didn't exist." A college history professor, attempting to describe that first view of the devastation, said simply, "I had to revise my meaning of the word destruction or choose some other word to describe what I saw. Devastation may be a better word, but really, I know of no word or words to describe the view." The mushroom cloud that Japanese generals saw rising over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, was not just the signature of a new weapon. It was the visible symbol of a threshold crossed, a line stepped over that humanity has never stepped back across. In the 80 years since, no nuclear weapon has been used in warfare. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the shadows burned into stone, the keloid scars, the leukemia victims, the children born with radiation-induced birth defects, have served as a testament to what must never happen again. But the immediate aftermath was chaos and confusion. Field Marshal Hayter was arrested by American occupation authorities after the surrender. In 1948, he was tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and sentenced to life imprisonment for war crimes, waging aggressive war and failing to prevent atrocities committed by troops under his command in China. He was not tried for anything related to Hiroshima. He was a victim of the atomic bomb, not its perpetrator. The charges stemmed from his earlier service. He was paroled in 1954 after serving just 6 years. He spent his final years heading a charitable foundation for the welfare of veterans. When he died in 1962 at age 82, he was the last surviving Japanese field marshal. At the moment of his death, he was attending a ceremony honoring the war dead. His final words, if he spoke any, were not recorded. Emperor Hirohito, who had broken the deadlock and ended the war, told multiple people over the following weeks that it was the atomic bomb that had made his decision possible. On August 8th, he told Foreign Minister Togo that the new weapon made continuing the war impossible. In his surrender rescript on August 15th, he cited a new and most cruel bomb as a reason for capitulation. In September, he wrote to his son that Japan's deficiency in science, a euphemism for atomic weapons, had been decisive. And when he met with General Douglas MacArthur on September 7th, he stated explicitly, the peace party did not prevail until the bombing of Hiroshima created a situation which could be dramatized. This was not simply face-saving. It was recognition of a new reality. Wars could now be won without invasion, without the massive land battles that military tradition had always assumed were necessary for final victory. The atomic bomb had made Operation Ketsugo irrelevant before a single American soldier set foot on Japanese soil. Yoshio Nishina continued his scientific work under occupation, focusing on medical applications of radioisotopes. American physicist Harry Kelly, who had been sent to assess whether Nishina should be purged from academic life, instead became his friend and advocate. Kelly wrote in his assessment, "He was an international scholar, respected all over the world, and he had spoken out against the war. I said it was against everyone's interest to purge that man." Nishina died of liver cancer in January 1951 at age 60. Some suspected his illness was connected to radiation exposure from his time in Hiroshima, but this was never confirmed. Kelly remained close to Nishina's family for the rest of his life, and when Kelly died, his ashes were buried next to Nishina's grave in Tokyo, a gesture of scientific brotherhood that transcended the war. The debate about what caused Japan's surrender, the atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion, internal, political pressure, or some combination of all three, continues among historians, but the participants themselves left clear testimony. The emperor said it was the bomb. Foreign Minister Togo said it was the bomb. Prime Minister Suzuki admitted in a December 1945 interview that the atomic bombs showed Americans no longer needed to invade, which made Operation Ketsugo meaningless. The military holdouts, Anami, Umezu, Toyoda, never fully articulated what they believed. Anami chose death over explanation. Umezu and Toyoda eventually accepted the emperor's decision, but their private thoughts went unrecorded. What we know is that they were willing to sacrifice millions of Japanese lives for a strategy that depended on the Americans fighting the kind of war Japan could respond to. The atomic bomb removed that possibility. It was a weapon beyond their experience, beyond their training, beyond their ability to counter. And they knew it, even if they could not bring themselves to say so until the emperor gave them permission to surrender. Looking back from 8 decades later, what strikes the modern observer is how close the decision was, how narrow the margin between surrender and continued catastrophe. If the emperor had sided with the hardliners, if Anami had been more persuasive, if the second bomb had not been ready when it was, if the Soviets had not invaded when they did, any of these variables might have extended the war. And if the war had continued even one more month, hundreds of thousands more would have died. Not from atomic bombs, which were not yet available, but from conventional bombing, starvation, disease, and the slow collapse of a society under total siege. In 1947, Emperor Hirohito visited Hiroshima. He stood before the ruins and observed a moment of silence. Throughout the rest of his long life, he died in 1989 at age 87. He continued to publicly mourn the deaths caused by the atomic bombings. Whether this was genuine grief, political necessity, or some mixture of both, only he knew. But the gesture itself mattered. The man who had been proclaimed a living god, the man whose decision had ended the war, acknowledged the weight of what had been done to his subjects. Dr. Hachiya, the hospital director who had struggled to find words for what he witnessed, wrote in his diary on August 6, 1945, "For the first time, I realized that we had reached the end, Hiroshima's end, Japan's end, perhaps the world's end." He was wrong about the world's end, but he was right about the threshold. Something fundamental had changed. The Japanese generals who saw the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima were witnessing not just the destruction of a city, but the obsolescence of everything they had been trained to understand about warfare. The strategies, the tactics, the calculations of acceptable losses, all of it had become irrelevant in the span of 43 seconds, the time it took for Little Boy to fall from 31,000 feet to its detonation altitude of 1,900 feet. What they said in those moments, Hata's silence, Anami's defiant certainty, Nishina's scientific confirmation, reveals how human minds react when confronted with the previously unimaginable. Some deny, some rationalize, some accept and adapt, but none can look at such a thing and remain unchanged. The mushroom cloud rose to 60,000 feet in about 10 minutes. By the time it dissipated, the world below had already entered a new age. The generals looking up at that cloud were men of the old world, trying to understand a weapon that belonged to the new. What they said mattered less than what they had to learn, that certainty is fragile, that technology can outpace strategy, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.